This is Behind the Verdict. I'm John Horford with Marion Cook and Christina Capron. Once again, special guest host.
Hi.
Welcome. Today we are going to wrap up our little series on the Menéndez brothers. We're going to answer, or we're going to address questions that we got from TikTok, Instagram, text, and a variety of other ways. And the main question that we want to address as well for this episode is, whether the brothers were or weren't sexually abused. What are the implications of releasing individuals who have committed extremely violent crimes back into society? So let's get started with that question. I'd love to hear answers from both Myrene and from Christina.
Well, she might have the stats on something like that.
She probably, Myrene's, that's why Myrene's amazing to have.
I think before we really hit that question, one of the things we hit first of all too, and I think we ended our last episode with this question, was whether you believe the boys were sexually abused or not, does that justify the brutality of the murders that they committed against their parents? And I think both of their attorneys in the first trial and the second trial really tried to look at a theory of self-defense. Now, they couldn't use a regular theory of self-defense because you have to have an immediate threat of harm, meaning Jose was right there going to kill them that very moment, and they reached out and grabbed a gun and shot them. They didn't have that. That wasn't the circumstances. So they tried to use a legal definition, if you will, of something called an imperfect self-defense theory, where the boys actually thought that their lives were in danger, even though the immediacy of it wasn't there. So then getting to the question that John posed, are we looking at whether or not they should be released now based upon all of this? Was that the question you kind of posed, John?
Essentially, yes. And then, what are the implications of them being released if that indeed, is the path that ends up happening?
I think you also
said...
So
I think, too, we look at what the jury did at the time they convicted. And because California at the time had the death penalty, there's a phase that the jury has to make a recommendation on based on all the evidence and all the things that they heard and saw, and additional evidence that can be brought into the sentencing phase. And they had the choice to make whether it should have been a sentence of death through the death penalty or a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. And that's what the jurors decided at that time. As a prosecutor, I can tell you, certainly I'm concerned with any time there's a very brutal murder, letting someone be released from custody can be a very scary proposition, whether it is 20 years later or 34 years later, as it has been with the Menéndez brothers. I think there's a lot of things that we really need to consider and society should consider before they're released, not just necessarily have they served enough time, but is the community going to be safe if they're released? And that's a big question.
Do you know of any other cases where individuals were obviously guilty? Of course, there are cases where people receive sentences like life without parole, and then there's evidence that is found or utilized later, or whatever the case is, and they get off, or there's a confession later and they get off. But those individuals didn't actually commit those murders that they were accused of. Do you know of cases where the individuals are known without a doubt for a fact to be the people who committed violent murders, and then because of something like abuse or the mishandling of evidence or something, that sentence gets overturned? So there's no longer that life without parole sentence, and they go back into society.
I think there's been a lot of cases over the years, and certainly I've seen a few where, convictions were made And in my opinion, they were justly convicted. And then for one reason or another, the case was overturned on appeal. I can think of one that was a very brutal sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl that I tried. We had 10 different counts of sexual assault. And it was horrific, and we had a lot of evidence, and it got overturned 4 years into his 40-year sentence because of ineffective assistance of defense counsel. When that was overturned, this man was released from prison, and he was out in the community for about a year and a half before the retrial happened. Now, in some cases, there has been recidivism, meaning the person was released and they committed more crimes.
Was that the case?
Even going back to Bowman for a minute, Bowman was on bond for the attempted abduction of that young girl at gunpoint when he killed Kathleen Doyle.
Yep, in Norfolk.
Right. So there are some circumstances where the person may be released and they commit additional crimes. And so that's certainly one of the considerations, just one, but one that needs to be focused on whether or not there would be the potential for additional crimes.
I feel like one factor that plays a part is just the fact that it was targeted and like it was personal and it was their parents, like, and they immediately, well, Eric says he immediately regretted it after it happened. But I mean, I'm not going to say no one can commit a crime again, but I mean, let's just say they were abused their entire lives and then spent 30 years in jail. That seems like enough to me. I don't know. I also always think of the Gypsy Rose case and the abuse that she endured.
All right, explain the Gypsy Rose case for the people who don't know.
Oh my gosh, what's it called? Her mom had Munchausen by proxy, or I think that's the way, and kept her daughter sick her entire life and was, just horribly abusive in that way. And then Gypsy Rose had her boyfriend kill her mother, and Gypsy Rose is out. And the guy, I think, is still in jail because
he committed the murder.
Because he committed the murder, and he was not abused, I think, by the mom, obviously. Yeah. But I don't know. I honestly, in my mind, kind of think of them in that way. I feel like it was targeted. Why, if they got a chance at freedom, would they just ruin it again with another murder? Like, I don't know. But
I feel like people with severe mental illness or have experienced severe trauma aren't necessarily acting within the realms of like rationality always, Yeah. So, and an additional trauma would be having to go to prison for 30, how long have they been in?
34.
34 years. I mean, if that's not traumatic, I don't know what is. That sounds horrible.
Yeah, but it also gives you a lot of time to reflect on life, and I don't know. Yeah,
So you would release them?
I think they absolutely deserve to be released.
Myrene?
I think so.
Absolutely not.
Please.
I go back again to the jury had the choice to give them the death penalty or life without. They gave them life without parole. The brutality of what they did to their parents, the number of shots, the premeditation, the purchasing the guns with the false ID, all of those things, the picking up the shell casings to, thwart any ability of law enforcement to try to link them to it. Just the calculated and deliberate way that they did that. And then you throw in all of the red flags after the murder about erasing the will and trying to change all of that. And just the rest of the behavior is certainly concerning. Now, one of the therapists, I think it was Dr. Oziel, testified that he felt threatened by Lyle once Lyle found out that Eric told him what had happened. Now, Oziel probably has some issues of his own, I'll be honest with you, and may not be as completely credible himself. But if that were true and Lyle had threatened him and they are released, certainly one of the concerns would be anybody who testified against them in a negative light, would they be safe? Would they feel safe? I don't know. But that's always a question you have to ask, because they could look at the people who essentially testified against them and put them where they were for 34 years and say, you know what, I've got nothing else to lose. My life is over. Maybe I want to get back at you for that.
And to the point that you made initially, at the top of the episode, Myrene, and I guess you didn't phrase it in this way, but there are, it sounds horrible to say, millions of people who have been sexually abused, which is right. I mean,
But
genuinely.
by their father to that extent, it's also not just sexual abuse. Who has
Yeah,
more
but
control
still,
of you and your
there
childhood than your
are
father?
severe physical abuse, severe sexual abuse, whatever, mental abuse, however you want to classify it, there are like millions of people. And I don't think millions sounds crazy, but I don't think millions is, I don't think that's wrong. Obviously, we don't have exact numbers, but if all of those people had reactions in a similar way as the Menéndez brothers, I mean, everyone you know someone
I
who
think
has been,
Yeah.
physically or sexually or mentally abused in
And I
some way. And if
think-
people had those reactions to
I'm not
murder,
saying-
to hurt,
I'm not saying it's right, but I think they have the right to defend themselves and actually use their defense of abuse in their trial and let jurors make the decision. And I think
they have made the decision.
I know, but I think manslaughter, like having another option besides just first degree murder, they didn't have that. And I think that would have been more justice, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think one of the parts that often gets missed, and it's really hard for jurors, because I always try to go back and speak with them after our cases are done, whether they found the person guilty or not guilty. I want to know, what was hard for them? What did they focus on? What would they have liked to know in addition? And one of the things they always want to know are the things that legally I can't tell them. I generally can't always tell them what a person's criminal history is. In this particular case of the Menéndez brothers, there were things that were not legally admissible that you and I and everybody else might think, gosh, that should come in. That should be admissible. Why wasn't that allowed? Well, the law doesn't always let it come in, which is why I think the law didn't allow for the manslaughter choice as well. But I do think, even if you believe that they're abused, to John's point, there are millions of survivors out there who've been abused psychologically, mentally, physically, sexually, and they cannot all respond in this manner, in this brutal way. We have laws for a reason, and you can't simply do an eye for an eye and kill someone because they harmed you. Was Jose right? Absolutely not. Was Kitty right not to support or stand up for or protect her children? Absolutely not. But that doesn't give any person the right to take the law into their own hands, in my opinion.
Yeah. I feel like it sets a dangerous precedent. If they get out, imagine the amount of people who have been hurt and who are struggling, and they're totally valid in that. And it's extremely hard and difficult, and it impacts every aspect of your life. It impacts your relationships, your working life, your self-esteem, everything. They see that happen, and it's like, I can go get revenge too. What's stopping me from going after the person that? But people think that way. You think that they don't. People
I know,
genuinely
but
do.
I'm
just
not
saying it's
they
within
never
the realm. It's within the realm of possibility, is all I'm saying.
For sure.
Like, it sets a dangerous precedent.
Sure. Yeah. I'm not disagreeing.
I think it does too. And I think when, if that sets that precedent that, well, there was this abuse claim or these allegations, so our sentence should be mitigated, we may have people come forward. And I'm not saying this about the Menéndez brothers, but there may be people that come forward that say, oh yeah, I was abused, and maybe they weren't, and maybe there's no evidence of it, but they're going to try to use that as an excuse to get their sentence reduced. Because we see, if one thing works with an inmate in a jail, they all try the same thing, generally.
Yeah. I mean, I understand how that could happen, but I also think it's hard to actually convince people in this world. And a lot of people, don't want to admit to abuse because they feel guilt or whatever, I think it's just, I don't know. I think it's hard to do, but there's always bad apples that will try to lie and do that and make it harder for everybody, which is unfortunate. I'm with you.
Oh. As we've been saying in all of these episodes, it's an extremely complex case. Whether
I'm
you-
not-
like,
yeah, and I'm
whether you
never
believe
saying-
they were or weren't.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they were abused in some way. Whether you think that Jose raped them or not, I mean, like Myrene had mentioned in the first episode, and I had mentioned as well, but it could have been corporal punishment.
Bro,
It could have been.
it was not spanking.
I'm just saying it could have been anything, but that spanking can get severe if you hit a kid hard enough.
Yeah,
like
he used a belt. They
Yeah.
had, I mean, they had family members testify to abuse in front of their eyes when the kids were like 2.
For sure.
So if that's what he'll do in front of people, it is not crazy to think he would abuse them in the bedroom.
You say that, but then at the same time, I mean, there are people who just think that's normal. I have family members that I have literally witnessed them.
I'm not talking
just
spanking though.
Like hit their kid like hard, like way too hard.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, it's not good at all. It's not good at all. But I mean, that's my point. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's the sexual abuse. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because the crimes that they committed were so heinous that it's so unfortunate. It's sad. It really is sad. Whether it was the sexual abuse or the corporal punishment or whatever it was, I don't wish that on any person. I don't wish that on any kid. And it has these negative impacts that just ripple throughout their lives. The way they chose to react.
Do you think they're more of a monster than their father?
I don't think they're more of a monster, but they're all monsters then.
You know, one of the psychologists made the analogy that Lyle was very much like the father. He was manipulative and controlling and wanted things to go his way. And when they didn't, this psychologist said that Lyle would become explosive. And so, you know, that's something too to look at. You know, what is their potential for being explosive now? And that's a concern. You want to make sure people are safe. You want to make sure that they're safe. They're not doing anything that's going to harm themselves or others as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. I think we should get into some of the questions that we got from listeners. In response to your comment in the first episode, Myrene, episode 6, the first episode of the Menéndez brothers episodes, you had mentioned Lyle being shot not Lyle, Jose being shot in the back of the head. And someone had commented and asked where there was proof of him, the initial shot being like a shot to the back of the head. Do you have?
She said that was the 3rd shot in the last episode.
Did she? No, not the last episode.
I don't
2
think we knew
episodes
exactly
ago.
which.
2 episodes ago.
Last episode, she said that was.
Yeah, 2 episodes ago though. I'm just reading the questions that people had.
Got you.
Yeah, because we want to give people an opportunity to like have their
I know,
voice.
but I was sorry. I was kind of trying to answer for her.
Yeah,
I remember
but
saying
it's
that.
from a different episode.
Okay, sorry. I'll shut up.
It's okay. I love you.
Yeah, we don't know exactly which order they were shot in. When you look at the layout of that TV room they were sitting in, they were sitting on like an L-shaped sectional. And so the boys would have come in from the side, but there was room to stand behind where Jose was sitting. And so I went back and looked at as much of the autopsy material as was online, and it indicated that there were shots from the front and shots from the back. And the one specifically to the back of Jose's head was from the back. So it may have been a circumstance where they came in from the side, shot a couple times. Jose fell down because it looked like he'd been shot in the leg and in the arm, and maybe even the torso area, I think.
Did the defensive wounds, did Jose have the defensive type wounds that Kitty had, or like the wounds that he was trying to defend himself, like he put his hands up? Or
Yeah, he had at least one on one of his hands where he had put his hand up.
Okay.
If he had been shot from the front in the leg, the torso, the arm, and fell back onto the couch, maybe he couldn't get up, he couldn't stand because of that leg wound. It was pretty big to his thigh, I want to say it was.
Yeah.
They could have walked around to the back of him where maybe they didn't want to see his face when they shot him from behind.
Yep. Another question was asking about Kitty's brothers, because I believe that we had mentioned that he did not believe, one of Kitty's brothers or both, I cannot remember, did not believe that the parents had abused the boys. and the person had sort of alluded to the fact that they didn't have any type of relationship really with them and weren't close with them, and that it was based on nothing.
Yeah, so I went back and looked at that. There were two brothers, Brian and Milton Anderson, that were Kitty's brothers, and they both gave some testimony that they had been close. I think it was Milton maybe who didn't live physically close by, but that he was very close to Kitty and did see the family a lot and spoke with Jose very often. And it was Milton, I believe, that came out recently as well and said that Jose had told him that he was very disappointed with the boys and their spending and how they were behaving and getting into trouble like they did in Calabasas and committing home invasions. And that Milton claimed Jose told him he was cutting the boys out of the will. So it did seem like they had a lot of information. And I think people can be close even if they don't live in the same town. They can talk a lot, they can be close. Maybe they visited, often. I think those are details that we may not know, and only really Jose, Kitty, and Brian and Milton Anderson would know exactly how close they were. But certainly Milton had details about things that he would have only got from Jose and Kitty.
That's helpful. Thank you for that clarification. Another message that we got was from someone that actually lived in the same town as the brothers in New Jersey. And she had sent, I'll read her message. She said, "I'm from the same town in New Jersey that the brothers lived in. They were older than me, but it's not a big town, so we knew people in common. I also witnessed firsthand their spending spree. In my opinion, you're the only podcast I've heard who's gotten this right. I don't believe for a second that they feared for their lives. They were grown men and with very privileged upbringings. They had the means to leave, but they chose greed. I believe that their lawyer, Leslie Abramson, coached them with the abuse story and with more subtle details like dressing them in sweaters instead of the Armani suits that they usually wore and calling them the boys." And then she also mentioned that the restaurant that you talked about in the last episode, she knew that restaurant. She said she loved that restaurant, and they're famous for having like amazing wings, and they just bought it and immediately just ran it into the ground. It was almost like they didn't even try to do anything. It was just completely reckless. And not that that necessarily means that they're guilty, but it's just interesting to have these comments from somebody who lived in the same town at the same time, and they had mutual friends.
Yeah, I mean, they had all that money all of a sudden, and they were trying to make their dad proud and do something, but they were 18 and 20 years old.
I couldn't know how to do anything.
Yeah, exactly.
I understand that.
Like,
too.
I couldn't run a restaurant right now if I freaking tried.
most people who run restaurants can't run restaurants.
I think there were a lot of good points in that message from that listener. Lyle did try to buy that restaurant, and he had other people running it for him, but he really had no idea how to do that, how to manage money. Even when the parents were alive, the boys had trouble managing money, according to the family members who spoke out and said that the boys just spent money like it was water, like it didn't matter. And you can see that with their spending even after the murders as well. There were several times where Lyle would write checks and they all bounced because he never thought to balance his checkbook or to transfer money from savings to checking, that kind of thing. And that's how they caught him on that the time where he hired the computer company to come in and delete the will from Jose and Kitty's computer, because the check to the computer company bounced. So I thought that was a pretty interesting.
So you found actual proof of that?
Yeah, they did. The
Okay.
prosecution did.
Yeah, I mean,
I went back and looked at it too.
The next question is sort of it's related to the spending, and I think it's a pretty valid point. She said, "I think it's a valid response to spend lavishly." In this circumstance, she's like, we think about it as average people for the most part. They're rich, like
Beverly Hills rich.
Yeah, like they're used to just spending money in ways that seem obscene to us, but for them, it might just be like another day. It's like, what, you don't just like wear those types of clothes and cars, and you don't have limo drivers, and you don't have courtside seats? Like, where do you? Oh, I guess that's where the people who sit behind us sit. Like, you just buy those seats. Like, who knows?
I agree with that to some degree. Buying the Armani suits, that may be an everyday occurrence. Buying 3 Rolexes at one time might be a little extravagant. But I seem to remember, I think it was Eric had a Ford Escort and Lyle had, I don't remember exactly, maybe an Alfa Romeo, maybe something like that, a smaller convertible.
Yeah,
But then
Porsche, I think.
after the murders, he bought the Porsche
Oh,
and he bought Eric a Jeep Wrangler. And they had more than that. So yeah, while they had money to spend and it might be more than any of us would do on a daily basis, it was still pretty extreme. They bought a restaurant. I think they paid 50,000 a year to Eric's tennis coach to coach him so he could turn pro, and that really didn't look like that was ever going to be something that happened either. So there was a lot of money that was spent.
yeah. I mean, it's definitely a crazy. I get why the police are like, okay, this is dumb, but they're also just killed their parents and they're trying to make it look like everything's okay. And their dad has controlled their life in every aspect, their money, everything up until that. And then you have this freedom of all this money and your dad's gone, which is like you killed him. So you have this guilty conscience, but also you're happy because you don't have to face the abuse that you were dealing with your whole life. So I'm not justifying it. That's a huge red flag for sure, the spending. But I'm just trying to understand it, I guess.
Yeah, and who's to say how anyone would react in that situation?
Bro, I would
you
probably
wouldn't
spend
know.
a lot of money.
Yeah, you wouldn't know.
Maybe not
until you
after
went
killing my
through it.
parents, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even. Yeah, it's just hard to imagine.
Yeah, it is.
Were there any other questions from listeners that stood out to you, Myrene?
Something I wanted to touch on was how the defense handled it. So certainly calling an 18 and 22-year-old young men, boys, makes it sound like they're younger, number one. Dressing them in the sweaters and the pastel colors made them seem and look a little younger and less worldly, I guess, maybe than their Armani suits might have.
Yeah.
But one of the things I had pointed out was, they saw three or four different psychologists, and then they finally said, hey, there's got to be more than this. There must be something horrific. And then it seemed like right after that, these abuse allegations came out. I found two really interesting quotes. Lyle said that he never went over questions with his attorney, nor did Eric, because they both said their attorneys wanted their responses to be genuine and to be without actual practice. If that's the case, why then did the defense attorneys spend 4 to 5 hours a day for months and years prepping the boys when they weren't going over questions with them? I find that really weird to me. As a prosecutor, if I'm going to talk to my witnesses about cases, I'm going to talk to them about things I may ask them about. So I kind of have an idea of what they might say or how they might respond or that kind of thing. But if you're not doing that, what are you spending those 4 to 5 hours a day, every day for months and years doing?
Do you think maybe they just didn't ask the questions of like the specific abuse questions? Like they wanted that reaction of them telling that story to be real? I agree that's a long time. How else do you prep besides what you're going to say?
And how does that never come up?
Yeah.
That many hours.
I mean, it seems like a lot. It's just one of the red flags that as a prosecutor, I prep cases. I do. I'm an over prepper. I want to know. I want to go through details. I want to know how they're going to say it so I can respond and figure out what the defense might say. And, you try to do all of those things, but that's an awful lot of time. And so it just seems a little weird to me. Like if they're not doing that, what are they doing? And then on top of that, between the two trials, Lyle had sent Eric a letter talking to him about some of the things that Lyle had testified to on the stand that Eric had never really known. But in that same letter, there were things that seemed a little bit like Lyle was coaching Eric. There were things that said, you remember we didn't do this for the money, right? And it's like underlined. And to me, that seems a little coaching on Lyle's part to remind Eric, hey, make sure you're saying we didn't do this for the money. It was for other reasons.
Yeah, I think it was worded a little differently. It was like, we didn't do this for the money underlined, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what he said in the documentary was they never talked about those things face to face, and it was like easier for Lyle to write it to him, and he had never shared those emotional things with him. And
so to wrap up, we want to thank everybody for sending in their questions. And we would encourage people to continue to send in questions. A lot of the questions that we didn't get to were just in a similar vein, or they're things that we've kind of already addressed like throughout the podcast. So please continue to send in your questions. Please continue to let us know if there are cases that you want us to look into or to look at from, a different perspective. Anything else from Myrene? Anything else from Christina? Christina, thank you for joining us, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
We've loved having you these last 2 episodes.
you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Myrene, anything else?
I really appreciate both Christina and the people that came in with questions talking about different perspectives, because I think that's one of the best ways we can all learn and see things outside of what our view might be, but maybe to open our eyes to other things. And so certainly, I've looked at this in various ways, and I look at it from the perspective of what everybody else has said. And I think it's important for all of us to do that. The more that we talk and the more details we share, it's really great to have you send in those questions and give us your opinions. So please continue to do that.
Well said. Our next episode will be on a completely different case, and it's in a little bit of a different vein than we've been going down, because this one is unsolved. So
And local.
To the Lansing area. So please tune in for that. And if you have any questions, we would love to hear from you. Please message us on our Instagram page at BTV_pod.
And if you like listening to our podcast, make sure you rate us and leave comments on that as well.
You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, except for Wondery. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.